business is Ewes-Ful Fiber Arts. That's E-W-E-S, which is like female sheep, a little play on words there. And normally I would be at Waterford this time of year. I've been a vendor at Waterford for 10 years, and I really miss being there. I love interacting with people and sharing my passion for my fiber arts with them. Today, what I'm going to do is take you down to my studio where I have my spinning wheels and my looms. And in this video, you're going to see the process of weaving to create a finished product. So we'll head on down. This loom has just finished working to help me make these two runs of scarves. This is an 8-shaft or 8-harness loom, which means I can do very complicated patterns. And I'll explain to you now exactly how the threads have to go through in order to do something that is a more complicated pattern like this. The threads, first of all, are going to come from over the breast beam through the reed. The reed is on the beater bar, and the beater bar is what's going to help me create my fabric. But each thread individually has got to go through the correct slot. Now, since this is a scarf run, they only were going through about this wide. Once each thread has been put through one dent in the reed, the next part is where the design comes in. There are heddles that are attached to each of these 8 harnesses. And remember, the harnesses raise and lower, so they would raise and lower the heddle that has the thread going through the eye in the center. In order to get the design that I just showed you, I have to thread it such that the first thread goes through the heddle on the harness number 2, then the heddle on the harness number 3, then number 4, then number 5, then number 6, then number 7, then number 8, and then the next one starts back down, number 7, number 6, number 5, number 4, number 3, number 2, number 1, and that repeats all the way across. This is actually a pretty simple threading for an 8-harness loom, just going up and back. Sometimes your threading would be to put through number 1, number 2, number 4, number 8, number 2, number 3, number 5, number 1, number 4, number 2, and it can get very complicated. This is a pretty simple one. The way the design is made then is by using the treadles, which are down below, so that I have treadles hooked up to my harnesses such that each treadle raises a certain number of harnesses. What I'm depressing now is raising harness number 2, 5, 6, and 8. What I'm depressing now is raising harness number 2, 3, 5, and 6. So the pattern in which I depress those treadles, and there are 8 treadles that I can depress, raising 8 different combinations of harnesses, that's what determines how the pattern in the finished fabric is made. Okay, so this is a warping reel, and what the warping reel is going to allow me to do is it's going to allow me to make a continuous thread of 26.5 yards, which is how long I need each thread to be, and I will make bundles of it. But by winding it round and round and following this path that I've made, I know this path is 26.5 yards, then I will be able to quickly end up with a bundle of about 100 threads that are all 26.5 yards long. Certainly a much easier way to do it. So I'm going to start out by choosing my colors and deciding what the project's going to look like, what order the colors are going to come in when they're on the loom. So I've decided I'm going to start with this green, and the yarn is going to follow my path all the way around, and you can see how quickly this is going. And as I go round and round, I'm keeping 2 threads at a time going. That way I'm not winding just 1 thread at a time, which obviously would take twice as long. Now I get to what I know is 26.5 yards. And I start coming back and I follow my path back. I like to make random stripes, not exactly the same, like not exactly 3-inch wide stripes or 2-inch wide stripes. So what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to put, I think I'll put maybe 6 threads of green on this part. Okay, it's been about an hour and a half, and actually this is now the second set of approximately 100 threads that I have put together. And as you can see, I do it very randomly. In these shawls that I'm making, which I'll show you in a minute, I like just a random stripe pattern. It doesn't have to be exactly the same number of threads in each colorway. I just put it up and play with color as I want. Once I've done that, I have to tie it in sections. You can see here was the lead yarn that I was doing to measure. And then I'm going to come down to the bottom, and I'm just going to chain off. It's kind of like a crochet chain. I'm just going to chain off all of these threads. Now they are in order and they have been tied every 2 yards. So I'm just going to continue on until I have got all the way to the very end of this 26.5 yard warp, which obviously was much easier to do on this warping reel than any other way. Now I'm at the end and I can pop it off, and I'm ready to go over to the loom and put all of this on the loom. Now we're ready to start the teal, green, and blue project that we're working on. I've brought some of the warp over here. The rest of it will be brought over to the other side. And what we're actually going to be making today is something that I sell at Waterford and all my craft shows. And I'm always explaining to people how I can possibly do this, because this is a V-shaped shawl. And it's going to be done on this loom that it was sitting on. It's actually done on just 4 shafts. And the V shawl is 2 panels that are woven together on the loom to create the plaid. Now I showed you just a minute ago about how threads have to come through the heddles and come through the reeds in an exact order. And that's a very tedious and time-consuming project. I usually warp up a loom to do a minimum of 5 to 10 projects of the same color. This is called a dummy warp, and you can see that I've got all the threads that I used for that black and gray and red shawl. And when I finished and cut it off, I left these on here. Now what I can do is, these warp threads that I have already lined up ready to go, instead of having to go each one at a time through the reeds, through the heddles, what I can do is, in order, I will just tie them onto this, pull it through, and wind on. So I will get busy tying on, and we'll come back later to show you when it's been wound on. Well, it's about 3 hours later. Fortunately, you didn't have to watch all that. But what I did was I took all of that warp that I had made a big long chain out of, and I had 2 sections for a total of 197 threads. I put one section in a pile on this side and one section in a pile on the other side. And you saw in the pictures just a second ago between sections that I had to pull through and detangle as they went through, so that they would go through the dents on the reed, which are the sections in the reed, and then they also would be pulled through the heddles. Now remember, all I did was I tied them onto the black and gray and red that was left over from the last run of shawls I had done. If I was starting a brand new project, I would have to put one thread at a time through the correct dent and then through the correct heddle. And it might be a heddle on the first shaft, or the second shaft, or the third, or the fourth, depending on my pattern. What I'm doing today for this is a very, very simple tabby weave, which basically just means over one, under one, over one, under one, over one, under one. But but I don't want to have to go with my hand or with my thread or a needle with the warps all laying flat. So what I will do is I will raise harness 2 and 4 or harness 1 and 3, and in doing that I open up every other one, and that's where the yarn can pass through. This is called the weft yarn, and I'm just using this gray to open it up and spread it out, because you see I've got these spaces here, which is not what I want for a nice even weaving. So I'm just alternating feet, raising, first of all I'm raising 1 and 3 and beating down, and now I'm raising 2 and 4 and beating down. And remember, when I say 1 and 3, I'm referring to these harnesses or shafts which raise the heddles, which therefore raise the threads. So just by putting a few passes through, I've now spread it out evenly, so now I'm ready to start my shawl. The panels in this one will be teal, so I'll go ahead and start through. I'm using a bobbin in a shuttle. The bobbin has the yarn on it. The shuttle allows the yarn to go through. And then the beater bar beats it back. The shuttle sends it through, and the beater bar beats it back. The shuttle sends it through, and the beater bar beats it back. Now I'm starting to create my fabric. My fabric is going to be woven continuously for 42 inches before the next stage of the creation of a V-shawl. I'm going to pass through just a couple more times so you can see what that fabric looks like. And then you'll take a break while I finish the 42 inches. So here we have the fabric at the beginning, and you can see how the thread has gone over, under, over, under, over, under the whole way, alternating up and down, up through the warp threads. All of the warp threads are wound around the back beam, which is called the warp beam, and that's 26.5 yards. So I'm going to keep weaving, and when we come back, I'll show you the next step in making a V-shawl. I've been down here happily weaving, and I've got to the point where this panel, which needed to be 42 inches, is almost completed. The way I know that it's 42 inches is that I have put a measuring string that started at the beginning of my weaving, and you can see now I'm down to just the last inch or so. So I'm going to complete that with a few more passes of the shuttle. Again, my feet are causing the harnesses to lift. When I press down on treadle number 1, it's tied up to lift harnesses 1 and 3. When I press on treadle number 2, it's tied up to lift harnesses 2 and 4. And by alternating back and forth, I can get my weave structure. Again, this is a very simple, basic tabby weave, we call it, where it's just over 1, under 1, over 1, under 1. So let's see how I'm doing with my measuring. And it looks like I've got about 2 passes left. And I'm going to take off this bobbin, and I'm going to put on my gray bobbin, because what I have to do now is I have to, first I'm going to advance the fabric so that it's winding onto the fabric beam. And now I'm going to just use a few passes of the waist bobbin, the gray yarn, to hold my weaving in place. Because the next thing I'm going to do is actually take this panel off, but instead of cutting it off right here, I need to measure 32 inches of unwoven yarn. And I'm going to do this with a 32-inch long piece of yarn. Again, I'm just using some extra waste gray yarn. I've put that there. And now I'm just going to really advance this warp and let everything wind onto the fabric beam. I'm going to bring it to where it's just about even with the front beam. I'm going to use my scissors, and now I've got 32 inches of unwoven warp, and I will cut it off to get ready to weave the second panel. Now this is really what it's difficult to explain to people when I'm at a show and they want to know, how do you get the two panels together in a V? So this panel, which has been completely woven and is now ready to come off, is, oh, looks like I forgot to cut one. There we go. This panel is a woven panel. It's got unwoven warp threads, and where I tied on at the very beginning will now be untied, and then I will tie on this warp that's still on the loom, and that's going to be the beginning of my second panel. So after I finish the second panel, I'll show you where the magic happens. Okay, I have finished the second panel. I've left it on the loom. This is the first panel that I cut off the loom. And remember, I had all these extra threads that I pulled through before I cut it off the loom. This is where the magic happens. This is where I start to create the V effect. And I'm going to do that by putting those extra warp threads that I left on the first panel through the warp that's still on the loom in the second panel. And again, I'm alternating from lifting shafts 1 and 3 and shafts 2 and 4, and that way I can get my thread going through over, under, over, under. Now I've changed my color, and so I'm going to start getting a plaid effect. There's a few of this wood smoke color going through. Now the V has been created by these two panels going together at the 90-degree angle. The beater bar is what I pull down to bring the warp thread flush against the fabric that's already been created. Got one more wood smoke to go, and then I'll have an azure coming through. And I think the plaid will start to become more obvious. And here comes the azure. I have to be very careful that I do get the very next thread in the sequence. Sometimes it's a little tricky to figure out exactly which one is coming next. But it usually comes along all right. So now you can see that I've added the azure. Now that I just used the wrong foot there. Now you can see that I've added the azure. I do have a plaid effect starting. I'm going to go ahead and keep weaving this, and when I get to the end, I'll show you what the final step is. Well, after a little more than an hour's work, I have finished putting all of those threads that were left over from the first panel into the end of the second panel, and now you can see this is the plaid that's created by the two striped panels coming together to form the V in the back. I've put in a little bit of waste yarn. I'm going to now pull it through enough so that I can cut it off, and I want to leave a 6-inch bit of the warp for the fringe that will be on this side of the V. The fringe for the other side of the V was already tied when those threads were woven through. So let me measure off my 6 inches. And right about there. I'm going to pull through just a little bit more. It always helps if I have an idea based on the breast beam where I'm cutting. Cutting is always very final. It better be the right place. And through all this, I think I have forgot to mention that this is 100% wool that I'm making this V-shawl out of. So now as I pull it off, you can see why we call it a V-shawl. And what I will do is I will do some of them weaving with the teal color in the panels, and then I'll also do some of them weaving with the light blue that's in the stripes, so that the panels will look a little bit different, but the V will be the same. Hope to see people at Waterford next year. I'll have V-shawls and plenty of other things, but right now they are available on my Etsy site. The Etsy page is listed under Ewes-Ful Fiber Arts, which is E-W-E-S-F-U-L, because E-W-E-S is female sheep. Thanks for watching. Hope you learned something about weaving.